Hi, this is Pastor Jason Abbott with Glade Baptist Church. If you're a member of Glade Baptist Church or a visitor, then we're glad you're keeping up with us on these videos. And we're going through this Bible study together. And if you're somebody who just kind of dropped in to check out our content and watch along with us, well then we appreciate that. We're glad you're doing that. We welcome that. And all of you that have sent comments and questions through personal messages on Facebook, I appreciate that. We'll keep doing that. Keep them coming. It's good to keep discussing the Bible with you guys. Today, we're doing part 2 in our series, and I want to tell you something real quick about that. Part 2 is actually related to the same content as part 1. And so, with part 1, if you haven't seen that message, you might want to go ahead and do that. But part 1's message has a Bible study with it. It's about a 30-minute video. You can see it on Facebook or YouTube. But it goes with that one. But because the content of the message is reflecting back on that, if you haven't seen the first one, the Bible study would be equally applicable to today's study. And so that could be helpful to you if you'd like some more details, about what we're talking about, some information, some history and background that we cover in the Bible study, then it might be something that you're interested in. So I just want to mention that. Today, we're starting part 2 in our series called Faith and the 21st Century. And we're in Acts chapter 17 is what we're going to be talking about. And in Acts chapter... Got the wrong one. Just one second. Okay, Acts chapter 17 is titled Jesus the Judge, is what we're doing in our Bible study. So part 2, Jesus the Judge. Now I want to give you a little bit of context for what we're talking about today because, like I said, it's very much tied to last week's content. Where we left off in Acts chapter 17 was a point where the missionary Paul had gone into the city of Athens, Greece, and it's a very different experience for him. He is seeing all these idols and all their pantheon of gods, and they believed in all these different gods for everything and all these goddesses. But they also had a big diversity of beliefs about philosophy and how you should live and how you should order your life and what's important and what's not important. So they had all that going on with it. And so Paul walks into this very different kind of landscape of ideas and beliefs. And so it's very much like us today in our 21st century. You can spend a few minutes clicking around on a computer, and next thing you know, you're exposed to all these different beliefs, so very different, so very strange from maybe anything that you've encountered before. So in that sense, we can kind of, stand next to Paul and kind of understand a little bit about what he was seeing and understanding. So he's in Athens for a little while, and at some point he's brought to the courts. And they want to have a hearing because they have a law about bringing in and proclaiming foreign gods to the people. And so they want to have a hearing. They want to discuss with Paul about what he's been teaching in the synagogue and the marketplace that they've been hearing him. They want to know what he's up to. Paul, explain yourself to us. And so they bring him in for this hearing at a place called the Areopagus. And so this court with these judges are hearing him make his defense about why he's there and what he's up to and what he's teaching. And so this is what we see in Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34. So he does this, and he does it in such a unique way because when he gives his defense about what he's teaching, he makes a point to address a lot of the beliefs that they have. And so he talks about their beliefs about gods and goddesses and making idols, and he talks about their different philosophies and different things. And so he makes a very pointed effort to address their beliefs while bringing out his. And so it's a very amazing speech. If you haven't read it, I suggest you do and reread it because it is such a well-written, clever speech to these people because they are the ones with such a big variety of beliefs. And yet he's meeting them on that level and addressing their ideas and their philosophies. So he's doing that, and he brings up this idea to them, which would have been very strange. He brings up the resurrection of Jesus. And then he talks about Jesus as being the judge. the judge over everyone, the ultimate judge. And he says that in a setting where he's surrounded by judges. And he brings in the idea of judgment, that Jesus the judge will be bringing judgment on people. And so this must have been very strange for them. Maybe ridiculous to them, maybe nonsensical, maybe it's something they couldn't even piece together in some ways, maybe offensive to them, because them being Greeks already thought of themselves on a different status than anybody else. They thought of themselves as above everybody else in the world. In fact, they called everybody else barbarians. And probably even more so in Athens, because that's such a big area of intellectualism and schools and education. And so, maybe even more so in Athens. And so he brings this idea that, okay, there's this big pantheon of beliefs, the gods and goddesses and philosophies and ideas and things like that. There's all that. But what he is saying is that it's time to leave all that behind. God has done something in your midst. He has done something probably in all their lifetimes. I mean, this was not that far back. And so this wasn't like thousands of years ago or something like some kind of legend, that they heard about, from mythology. This was something that happened in their lifetime. And this was a place, not some far-off place that they'd never heard of or couldn't understand or maybe made up. This was a place that they could take a boat to. This was a place in the Roman Empire. And so he brings that to them, and he basically says it's time to leave that behind. And given the way he addresses all the different beliefs about the mythology and the philosophies, you have to understand it's time to put Jesus in first place, above all that. It's time to leave it behind and put Jesus in first place. And what he points to in his speech is the reality and the fact of the resurrection. Because whether you're in the first century when Paul was speaking to them, or in the 21st century where we live, whether you live in a culture like Greece, or Nairobi, or Mongolia, or Venezuela, or Canada, or wherever, all these different cultures, it doesn't matter what culture you live in, what time period you live in, what place you live in, doesn't matter any of that. We all as people have the same problem. We all have one thing in common. We all have the problem of death. And Paul says, look at what God has done through Christ. Look what God has done through Jesus. He has addressed that problem. Jesus has conquered death. And he has the authority and the power as now as judge. And he should. To bring judgment. And so like I said, they hear this and this probably would have been very offensive to them. But that's where they shut him down. That's where they dismiss him. That's where they cut him off. They said, okay, well, we've had enough. We've heard enough. Paul, you can go. And so they end it right there. Paul didn't get to tell him anything else about Jesus because they shut him down. So he's dismissed from the court at that point. But it's not fruitless because there are a few people there that join him, that leave with him. And so they've heard what he's had to say, and they want to hear more. And maybe the Holy Spirit's been working in their life to draw them. And maybe they become followers. We don't know all the story that goes along with that. But we know that he doesn't leave alone. But he was brought in alone. So that's what we were talking about last week. So now that you're up to speed, we can build on from there. Well, Paul's dismissed. And the big issue is the fact that Jesus is judge. And Jesus will bring judgment because he's judge. He's a perfect judge. And as offensive as that may have been to the people first hearing that in Athens, it's probably just as offensive to a lot of people in America today. A lot of people in the western part of the world. In fact, it may be the most offensive message you could bring them. And so that's what we're going to be tackling today. The fact that this can be the most offensive thing to them. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Because as the title of our series on part 2, Jesus, he is the judge. Well, people think when this is brought out, a lot of times people think that, well, this isn't Jesus as judge and bringing judgment. That's an archaic belief. That's something that should have been left behind a long time ago. That's a remnant. That has no place in the 21st century. Well, they would be 180 degrees wrong, because it's very important to embrace and understand this belief. It's very important. It's very practical, and it's going to be very beneficial as well. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Some objections that people have when they think about this message as Jesus as judge, bringing judgment. Some objections. Well, some are offended by the idea that somebody is a judge over them. They're offended that because if somebody's a judge, a perfect judge and the ultimate judge, then it's his standard of right and wrong that everything is measured by, because he's judge. He knows what's right and true. And so all of a sudden now you have this competing idea. Well, if he knows what's right and he's the judge, well then what I think and the way I feel and the way I've come to understand, that could be wrong. Well, yeah, it very well can be. And so there is some tension there, because when you bring the idea of judge and judgment, there is the idea that there is a set standard of right and wrong. Whether you're in Cambodia or Colorado, there is a set standard of right and wrong. And there is an idea that's very real called sin. And so a lot of people in the 21st century secular world, they hear that and they push back against it. Okay? Another thing that they find offensive is that, well, they're offended by the idea of him being judge, bringing judgment. Okay, they're offended by that. But if you take that idea that they're offended by and say, well, are you also offended by seeing God as forgiving and one who brings grace? Well, God's a forgiving God and he gives people grace. Well, no, they don't find that offensive at all. They would a lot of times embrace that idea. They would they would think that is probably the preeminent idea to bring. That's who God really is. He's a forgiving God. If there is a God, he's full of grace for people. But here's the thing: they're offended by the idea of Jesus as judge, bringing judgment, but they embrace the idea of God being forgiving and bringing grace. If you go to the eastern part of the world, to a different culture, you see the exact opposite. You see a whole lot of people who would naturally be quite offended that you have this concept of God being very forgiving to people and bringing grace to people. That would be offensive to them. In fact, they would wholeheartedly embrace the idea of God as judge, who would one day bring judgment. They would think that would be the right way to put the emphasis. And so what they're offended by is quite different from what you're offended by. So somebody who's in that position, you could say, well, are you saying then that what you're offended by trumps? It's more important than what they're offended by, that you're right and they're wrong? Well, they would probably push back against that, because they have that moral relativism kind of viewpoint with the world, and so they would never say, well, no, I wouldn't say that I'm right and they're wrong on all this. But that's exactly where they end up, because they're saying that what I believe about God and how I think he really is more important than what you think. And I can accept a God of forgiveness and grace, but I can reject a God of judgment who is one day going to act as judge over everyone. And so you get into very much a cultural dynamic there. The reason people, it's just a cultural perspective, the reason some people embrace one idea about God and find another one difficult is particularly from a cultural perspective. Now, if we believe, and a lot of people would get on the same page with this, even people with more of a secular mindset, if we believe that God is above culture, that He's perfect, and He is above every culture, if they would think along those lines, then you would naturally expect every culture in the world to be somewhat imperfect, because He's the one who is perfect. And if all the cultures in the world are in some ways imperfect, then wouldn't you expect them to have elements in their culture that contradict Him? That where He would find a place where they are wrong? You would expect to find that in imperfect cultures. That's what you would expect. Because the way He teaches and the message He brings is one of perfection. And so it would be quite natural and expected to find cultures throughout the world that believe certain things about God that are wrong and embrace other things about God that they know are true. But He's above culture. And so you naturally expect that tension because no culture is perfect. Well, I know some of these objections are quite reflexive, and a lot of these things people haven't really thought about. And it's almost like saying a situation with a parent and a child. You know, a child doesn't understand why parents make the decisions the way they do. They don't understand why some things are important and some things are less important. They don't understand, the wisdom behind their parents' judgment, right? They just don't grasp that. And so they may debate it, and they may push back against it, and they may even be offended by it. But as they get older and they mature, and they really thought about things, well, you see them adopting a lot of their own parents' perspective. And you find out that, wow, that mom and dad were really quite smart. And wow, mom and dad really had the right idea about this. And somebody even would say, like when they're a parent, after all those years, say, well, I opened my mouth up and my mom came out. Because they hear themselves saying something exactly like their mom would say. And they hear themselves saying something that your dad would say, because they've come to accept the values and the beliefs over time, because they've grown and they've matured and they started to understand things. So I know a lot of these things that people may be offended by may just be a kind of a quick reflex. They haven't really thought about it. Okay? And so that's what I want to do right now. I want to kind of help you along in this. If you find the idea that God is judge who will bring judgment, if that's offensive, look at it like this. Because I think this can be a very beneficial, a very positive, a very practical thing. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, there is an admonition. There's a command that shows up in both places. And one of the places is in Romans 12, 18 and 19. So if you have your Bibles, you can look at the New Testament book of Romans, chapter 12, verses 18 and 19. But what I'm talking about now shows up in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the idea, and I'll just read it to you from Romans 12, it says, "Do not take revenge on another, but leave room for God and His wrath. For it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." Now, some of you might have a different translation that each sounds a little bit different, but the idea is exactly the same. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I shall repay. It might sound like that. But the idea is that God is saying, you are not to take revenge. I'm the judge. I'm the perfect judge. You have to trust me to take vengeance on whatever wrong was done. I'll settle things rightly. I'll take care of it. I'll make sure it's right and done right in the right way, in the right measure. But you have to trust me to judge that and act accordingly. You do not take vengeance. Now, we would say we don't take vengeance because you don't seek revenge in your heart because, well, you're an imperfect judge. You're an imperfect judge. I'm an imperfect judge. And when we're hurt and somebody's done something wrong to us, and I mean something, significant, not somebody stealing your parking place. I mean something big, something hurtful, something painful. And some of you may actually be thinking about that right now, that something's coming to mind. When somebody's done something really big and awful to you, I mean, it's just created a wound. If you get a chance to harbor that bitterness, and you get a chance to take revenge, our tendency is not to do an equal measure. Our tendency is not only to get somebody back the same way they hurt us, but to go further. Our tendency is to not just make it even, we want to punish them for ever considering the idea that they should hurt us. We want to bring more against them. We want to hurt them even harder. That's what we have in us. And that's why we're imperfect judges. Because when we're dealing with something personal and emotional and hurtful, we don't get satisfied with just an equal measure of getting someone back. We want to go further. And look what we do. We end up in a cycle, whereas we make that choice and we go further. Hey, I finally had a chance to get so-and-so back. And then what? They'll get you back. And then what? Then somebody else. And you end up in a cycle. Because nobody ever feels like they've really true gotten even. Because now this thing has gone again and again and again. And nobody feels satisfied with that. Nobody does. Because we're relying on our own sinful, imperfect self to make the call. And God says, don't make that call. Rely on me. Trust in me to get it right. Trust in me to make the right judgment. Let me be the ultimate judge that I am. Trust in me to get it right. Get it perfectly done in the right way in the right time. He says, vengeance is mine. I will repay. I'll take care of it. Don't take revenge. Trust me. See, we're not fit to be judged. And when it's something really big and deep and hard to deal with, we're not going to get it right. And if we don't accept and embrace that idea that God is judged perfectly and God will bring judgment perfectly, if we don't embrace that, we don't understand that, then we're going to just get into an endless cycle of bitterness and anger and retribution and again and again and again. And it's going to spill over into other people's lives and people's lives that we probably never intend for it to be in. And God is calling us out of that. See, when we embrace the idea that Jesus is the judge and the perfect judge and he will bring judgment, then we can leave it in his hands. Then we can leave it in his hands. That's why it's so important. That's why it's so practical. That's why it's so positive. Because when we do that and we leave it in his hands, all the injustices that may have been done to us that we can't correct, no matter how hard we try, when we just leave it in his hands and trust him to be that judge and to judge perfectly, then we have a chance to move forward. Then we have a chance to rid ourselves of bitterness. Then we have a chance to get out of that rut. then we have a chance to put away that anger. Then we have a chance to grow, to heal, to be free from all that, and not carry that around. We only get to that point by understanding that I'm handing this over to somebody else. It's time for me to grow. It's time for me to move on from this. It's time for me to mature. Stop carrying that baggage. We only get to that point with embracing and understanding the idea that Jesus is the perfect judge, and he's going to bring judgment in the right way, in the right time. That's the only way. So, my prayer today is that if there is something that you're holding on to, and it's maybe been eating at you, and maybe you can't let it go, haven't let it go, maybe you haven't even been trying that hard to let it go, because sometimes you can get stuck in that rut and you can kind of enjoy it, that you're going to one day hold somebody's feet to the fire. My prayer is that you would accept the reality that Jesus is the perfect judge, and he will bring judgment. And you can trust and leave it in his hands and move on. There's no need to carry that any further. Give the forgiveness that you should be giving. Don't be tied down to it anymore. Trust God with it so you can heal. That's my prayer for you today.